Hi, Year 12. I hope you're well. Thank you so much for bearing with me while I sort out how to do video lessons for you. I hope that you are getting a lot out of your Zoom lessons with Mrs. Sales. And I can't do that at the moment just because I can't be in school at the right time. So for now, I'll be recording our PowerPoints and going through each bit step by step for our double lessons. So I really hope that that works. Please give me some feedback. Let me know if you can hear everything okay, if it makes sense, if you can access it, and if you have any questions, please email me as well. So I'm going to share with you today a PowerPoint on Omnibenevolence, which is the last bit of the unit on the nature of God that we have to do. And hopefully you've also seen the summary video from last time on all of the rest of that unit. So again, let me know if you have any problems. Okay, so let's find this PowerPoint. Okay, hopefully you have already done the reading from the textbook that I scanned and sent to you on Monday, because that will be a really important bit of context for this topic. So that's the syllabus, that's the whole unit of what we needed to do. Oh, there's a bit more. And we've already covered omnipotence, the first bit, omniscience, the second bit, and the last two sections we've covered as well on eternity and free will. So the one that we're going to do today is the topic on the nature and attributes of God. So we need to look at developments in the understanding of omnibenevolence, just judgment, and Boethius's idea on divine foreknowledge and eternity and free will. And we've already looked at Boethius, so we'll just link that into what we're doing today. So the word benevolence means all good or all loving. We don't tend to put the omni bit in front because it's like saying all loving, but I've put that on the title so you know that it fits in with omniscience and omnipotence. So the way that is good to remember what benevolence means is that the word love is in the middle of it backwards. So we're really talking today about the goodness of God and the love of God and what that means for Christians today. So what do we mean by love or loving? We'll be going on after this unit to talk about religious language, and it's really important when we look at language like that to think about what is it that means in different contexts. So in a philosophical sense, what does it mean to say that something is loving or that something is love? Because Christians would say, and Aquinas said, that it's not that God is loving, because that would suggest that there's kind of a scale of love and that sometimes God is more loving or less loving. But as Aquinas said about God being simple, it means that God doesn't change. So God is not loving, God is love. It's like God's DNA is love. That is who God is. So it does raise some big philosophical questions for us, such as, can God be affected by emotions and feelings? We think about love as a feeling. So does God have feelings? Does that mean that they change or perhaps limit his omnipotence in some way? So does God's love come and go? Can God love somebody one day and not love them the next? Christians believe that God's love for his people and that he's omnipotent or powerful. So why doesn't God stop evil? So the unit that we did on the problem of evil, there's a big link to this topic. And why does God allow us to make wrong choices if God knows that they will end up hurting us? So just as a little experiment as we start this, I want you to think about that word love and think about how you would define a loving cat. So you might want to write this down in your notes. If you write down cat, what kind of characteristics would a loving cat have? And I think of a loving cat as maybe a cat that would come and greet you at the door when you get home, or purr, come and have a cuddle at the end of the day. And that's different to how a loving child would act. So what would you say is different between a loving cat and a loving child? And finally, what then is different about a loving parent to a loving child? And I think, and because I'm a parent, I think of the love of a child and the love of a parent as looking quite different. The love of a child might look like affection, or being excited to be around that person. The love of a parent, although it's an unconditional love, or it's a love that never goes away, it doesn't always look like being nice or being kind. Sometimes it looks like kind of creating boundaries. You know, if my child runs out into the road, I might shout at them and grab them and stop them. Doesn't mean I don't love them. That is an expression of my love, because I'm trying to keep them safe. So love sometimes looks different in different contexts. And we sometimes talk about tough love. So I wonder if you think there is such a thing as tough love. What does that kind of look like, and how might that relate to this topic on the loving God? So just jot down some of your thoughts and ideas at this point before we kind of go into more of the philosophy of it, about what love is, how love can be different in different contexts. So if you just need to pause there and do that for a few minutes, then go for it and then start again. Okay, so although omnibenevolence can mean loving, we do tend to talk about it as well as meaning good. So one way of thinking about this issue today is to talk about the goodness of God. And there is a philosophical dilemma that is important to kind of understand at this point, and it's mentioned quite briefly in the book, but I think it's good to kind of go over that now, because it's not something we've done before in class, but it's definitely related to this topic. And it goes all the way back to Plato. So the Euthyphro or Euthyphro dilemma comes from Plato's writings, and really questions whether goodness is something that is linked intrinsically to God, or whether goodness is something independent of God. And it's also linked to something called divine command theory, which you might have looked at in ethics with Mrs. Sales. And it's a good term to just understand and to know and use in your essays. So the Euthyphro dilemma is something that Plato wrote, and like lots of Plato's work, it appears as a dialogue. So it's a conversation between Socrates and one of his students. In this case, it's not one of his students, but it's a conversation between Socrates and somebody else. And we don't know if those were conversations that really happened, or if Plato kind of made them up to use them as teaching points. But this is, quite an interesting story. So it features Socrates, as they all do, and a man called Euthyphro. And the story says that they are waiting outside the court, and Socrates is actually waiting for his trial that will lead to his death, because he was being charged with kind of conspiring against authorities and getting young people to be disbelieving of them and of the gods. And Euthyphro is actually there waiting to bring charges against his father for murder. And they start to have this conversation about what morality is, and how they know what the right thing is to do. It leads to this big question, and this is the Euthyphro dilemma. Is something good because God commands it? Or does God command it because it's good? And those questions seem really similar at first, but really they're very, very different. If you want to find out more about the Euthyphro dilemma, you can have a look. There's loads of videos on YouTube, and there's a crash course in divine command theory that explains this dilemma really well. So that's what it comes down to. Is something good because God commands it to be good? Because that means that if everything that God commands is good, then God could command someone to kill somebody, and that action would still be a good thing to do because God commanded it, so it's good. And if that's the case, then it leads to some really big questions and big problems, like, goodness is just kind of at the will of God, and it can change any moment, or something might be good one day and not be good the next day, and that is a really big problem for some people. So if it's true that something is good because God commands it, that leads us to all sorts of other problems. But at the same time, if we go for the second option, which is that God commands it because it's good, then that suggests that goodness is something independent of God. So that would mean that God didn't create goodness, and that goodness precedes God. And that is complicated as well, because it means God doesn't create everything. And also that God is not omnipotent, because God is also bound by something, which is this independent thing that is goodness. So there's some really big questions there, because if goodness is something independent of God, then why do we need God? Why can't we just find goodness on our own, just like God had to? And that's a really big question. So I'll let you mull that over a little bit. And in your notes, I want you to summarize this, please. Summarize what divine command theory is. Oh, I'm not sure I said. Divine command theory is believing that whatever God says is good should be done, so that we get our morality from God, whether that's from God's voice or from the Bible. That we know what we should do because God says that we should do that. That's divine command theory. And then make some notes on the Euthyphro dilemma, which is this whole problem of, is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? And I want you to write down, please, what are the problems with both of those ways of thinking? Which one do you think is more likely, the first one or the second one? Okay, so a lot of the reading that I set you to do at the start of the week was to do with benevolence in the Bible, and what the kind of evidence is for a good, loving God, and what the counter evidence for that is as well. So I'm not going to spend loads of time talking about this, but just going to highlight a few things that we see about God's goodness or God's love in the Bible. So let's start with the Old Testament. The Old Testament is, it contains the 5 books of Moses, which sometimes are called the Torah, which is the Jewish scriptures. It contains stuff, the same prophets as a lot of the Quran. So it's not just a holy book for Christians, but it is a source of wisdom for other religions as well. So in the Old Testament, God reveals himself as abounding in love and faithfulness, and that's from Exodus 34 when he's he's revealing himself to Moses, and really the whole Old Testament is this story of God's relationship with his people, the Israelites, and we have this other question really: are the Israelites chosen people because God chose them, or did God choose them because they were good? So it goes back to the Euthyphro dilemma a bit there, but the Old Testament is just all about this relationship between God and those people, and the covenants, the agreements that he makes with them. In a lot of places in the Old Testament, God is described as their parent, both male and female. So a lot of analogies of God being a father, but also being a mother hen gathering her chicks. So there's a lot of that kind of symbolism of God being a parent. And in the Psalms that were written by David, there's a lot of talk of God's goodness and God's love as well. So one thing says, his steadfast love endures forever. But in the Old Testament, we also have this other side to God, that God also appears as a jealous God, a God of wrath and anger, and will in some places command the Israelites to kill people who don't choose to follow him. And also God punishes the Israelite people whenever they disobey him. So it's a complicated picture of a loving God, because we get these two sides, and there are parts where actually you say, well, that God seems to not be loving, and actually to be the opposite of that. There are philosophers like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens we'll look at later, who use these parts of the Bible to say God is absolutely not loving. But we'll come back to those in a moment, because Richard Swinburne is a philosopher who defends the God of the Bible, and he said that God's punishment is actually part of his love, like a parent. So like I said about, grabbing my child before they run into the road, that is a demonstration of love. So what Swinburne says is that these punishments that God gives to the Israelites people are a demonstration of God's love for them, because complete love includes punishment for wrongdoing. So the Old Testament also includes a lot of laws. So if we think about divine command theory, if we say that we know what we should do, we know what the right thing is to do if we follow what God says, then we follow the laws of the Bible, like the 10 Commandments. And most Christians today would agree with the 10 Commandments. They would say that they are rules for everybody to live by. Don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, honor your parents, have a day of rest. They're all good rules to live by. But there's, in the Old Testament, there's also loads and loads of rules about what sort of fabric you should wear, and what you should do if you have mold in your home, and about making sacrifices or even death penalties. So those rules are not consistently followed by Christians today, and so there is a little bit of a problem there with divine command theory. And I thought you would find this interesting, so I've sent you out with your work a letter, and it's called Dear Preacher, and it's a spoof letter, and it's really showing the problem with preachers or Christians who take some of those rules, like for example against homosexuality, but don't use all of them. And it shows a problem with kind of inconsistencies of divine command theory. So have a look at that at this point, and have a pause of the video. And then if you could write down what problems you think it raises about the goodness of God and divine command theory. Okay, so carrying on with benevolence in the Bible, we then need to look at God's love demonstrated in the New Testament. So the New Testament is the part of the Bible that is about Jesus' birth, his life, his death, his resurrection, and then the work of the early church, so the first Christians after Jesus' death. And the New Testament definitely shows a different side of the love of God, or it emphasizes more that loving, compassionate side. And Jesus demonstrates love and compassion through healing miracles, where it says, Jesus had compassion on them and healed them. Also his treatment of the poor, of outcasts, like people with leprosy or people with all sorts of diseases, and his treatment of women as well. People would say for that time was revolutionary and showed love and compassion. And ultimately, Christians believe he showed his love for humanity by his death on the cross. And probably the most famous quote from the Bible that you will see kind of on posters outside churches is from John 3:16, which says, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. And we've looked at that before, I think. The New Testament uses the term agape for love. So that's a Greek word. There are actually 4 different words for love in the Greek language. So you've got, see if I can remember them, storge, philos, eros, and agape. So storge is love of things, like possessions, like I love those shoes. And then you've got philos, which is love for family. So I love my son, I love my sister. Then you've got eros, which is romantic sexual love. And finally you have agape, which is selfless and unconditional love. And so when the Bible talks about the love of God or the love of Jesus in the New Testament, it uses the term agape. So it's not just about feelings, it's love that's shown through actions. And John 1 also refers to God as the source of love. Let us love one another, for love comes from God. So that goes back to the idea of Aquinas, that God is not just loving, but God is love and is the source of love. And yeah, Aquinas says that it's God's love for us that it's analogous, so it's like an analogy. We can't understand it properly or fully, and so love is probably not enough. That word's probably not enough. There needs to be a different word when we talk about the love of God. Okay, so problems are of course the problem of evil. So we've already studied the problem of evil in great depth, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I just want to remind you that one of the kind of branches of the inconsistent triad is omnibenevolence, because people like Hume and Mill would say, oh, sorry, that should say Mill, not Hume. So this guy in the grey black and white picture is John Stuart Mill. And both of them say that God cannot be loving. We cannot believe in an omnibenevolent God because of the existence of evil. So God's love is undermined by suffering and evil. And I just want you to, at this point, to remind yourself of what the responses of that are from Augustine and Irenaeus. So in your notes, try and quickly write down, what would Augustine say about that? Why would he say that God is loving? And what would Irenaeus say? What would be Irenaeus's argument that suggests that God still is loving, even if evil exists? Okay, so you might remember then from looking at Augustine and Irenaeus's Theodicies that God is good, but there are still things that actually need to happen for God to be good. So God's goodness seems to demand two things, and one of those is that a person has the real freedom to choose to be wicked. So we said, and we talked about, what was it? The modern understanding of Irenaeus' Theodicy, Hick said that if God created us without free will, then we would have the goodness of robots. And that doesn't show a loving God. If God really loves humanity, then God has to give them free will. Because if we were programmed to do everything that he wanted us to do, then we wouldn't be free, and therefore he doesn't really love us. So a person has to really be free to choose evil in order for God's goodness to not be undermined. And the second one is that people are treated fairly. So if God is good, God will treat everybody fairly. And this would entail that people who are wicked or evil are punished, but also that people who experience lives that are full of suffering, where they're not to blame, are compensated. And there are parables in the Bible, like the parable of the rich man Lazarus and the parable of the sheep and goats, that suggest this as well, that God will work all things out in the end, that people who have behaved in an evil way will be punished, and people who didn't have any choice and suffered will be rewarded or will be compensated for that. And so that suggests that for God to be good, humans need to have free will, but also there needs to be a reward and punishment system, that if God is really fair, that there will be a punishment for sin and there will be a reward for being good. Okay, and that leads us to Boethius, and I don't really want to go back over Boethius at this point because we looked at him a lot when we talked about eternity, but just to link that in is to say that Boethius agreed that God is just in rewarding and punishing. So God knows what will happen. God sees all of our actions from I think he said, a high and lofty peak, because God has foreknowledge, but we are still free. And so God is just in rewarding and punishing us. So let's look at a few more criticisms. Richard Dawkins is one of them. Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion. And in green here, there's a quote from that. So I'm just going to let you read that for a moment. So Richard Dawkins is famous for not mincing his words, and there's a lot there. And there's a lot of quite specific criticisms against the God of the Old Testament as well. So what I'd like you to do is make some notes on this, please. So I would not copy the whole quote down, but find a short quote that you could remember and that you could use again in an essay. What do you think he's referring to from your reading of the God of the Old Testament? What sort of stories is he talking about there? But I want you to also be critical and think about, is he taking anything out of context there? How do you think a Christian might respond to what he said? And do you think he's guilty of ignoring kind of all the good God bits to come to this conclusion? And then another kind of very similar criticism of the God of the Old Testament is from Christopher Hitchens, and he wrote a book called God is Not Great, and here there's a quote from him as well. Okay, and so I'd like you to do the same thing for that quote as well. What do you think he's referring to? And is there a short bit of that quote that you could remember? You could write those down in your reading record that I've given you. I think I'll send out another one of those just for those of you who might have lost it or filled theirs up already. Because what we're trying to do, remember, all throughout this year is just collect little quotes and sources that we can refer to in essays. They're two, really strong and really interesting criticisms. But yeah, do remember to be critical and try and look at the other arguments as well. So that video, I think if you do all the pausing and the writing the notes, I think that's going to take you almost the first hour of your double lesson. What I'd like you to do then is to fill out this sheet, which I did send out at the end of last term. So, of course, this is talking about God being loving, but it can also be God being good, so omnibenevolence. Make sure you've got some scholars in there, key ideas like divine command theory, the Euthyphro dilemma, and those sorts of things. I've also sent you a little bit of reading that you can do as well, and I want you to fill in your reading record. So, stop sharing. I really hope that's helpful, and please can you send me your work at the end of this week, please, so by Friday afternoon. So I should see notes that you've made during this video, which will include what divine command theory is, what the Euthyphro dilemma is, God in the Bible, ideas about what love means, what God's goodness means, and your thoughts on some of those criticisms from Dawkins and Hitchens. So that's what your notes should look like. And then you've got a little bit of reading to do, and the sheet, the mind map sheet to fill in as well. So I hope you have a good week. Hope that's helpful. Do email me any questions, and there'll be another video lesson like this for the week after, next week. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.